All right, welcome to week 10. We are so close to the end of the semester for Introduction to C++, and this week is going to be a real cool one. We're going to talk about pointers and references today, and pointers and references is something that sets C++ apart from pretty much almost all languages, Java, JavaScript, Ruby, C#, all of those languages don't have pointers or references the same way that C++ does. So you may have heard of them, and you may think they're a little scary and confusing. Don't worry, we're going to take our time and go slow today. But before we get into it, let's do a little bit of a recap from our last section. What did we talk about last week? Does anyone remember? I know someone said recursion earlier, and that's right. We did talk about recursion in functions. So we'll go to week 9, and we'll actually take a look at some of the stuff just to recap, just to freshen up, to see what we talked about. So very quickly again, if you want to stop getting prompted for release, so that instruction is there. So we talked about recursive functions, which is basically a function that calls itself within itself. So examples of that are Fibonacci, right? The golden ratio, where it's calling itself and doing the Fibonacci of its own number. Another example that we talked about of recursion, and I think it was your lab, was if you had a penny every day and you doubled it and doubled it and doubled it and doubled it every single day, you'd call that function within that function to double it and keep doubling it for the n number of days until you get the value at the end of 30 days. Okay, what else did we talk about? Does anyone else remember? It is kind of here. What do we mean by prototypes and header files? A header file was basically a file we can include as a custom user file that contains code or functions that we don't want to bog up in our main.cpp. So we just include it like any other preprocessor directive, and it's just another CPP file, but instead of a CPP, it's a .h file with functions in it that we can call from that namespace. Okay, good. And then what do I mean by a function prototype? Well, remember here, so here's our PowerPoint. Function prototypes are basically just something at the top of our program that we tell the compiler what it should expect for a function, what it returns, what its name is, and the type of arguments or parameters to pass to it, so that when we're coding later on and we call that function, it can give us some auto hints or help with the compiler. So as we're typing, it can suggest, hey, I'm expecting an imaging, and can actually give some. So that's a function prototype. Cool. And then factorials was the other example of recursive functions, right? So you call the factorial function from within the factorial function, just so that it represents this mathematical equation. So instead of n, we actually have factorial as our function in this case. Cool. All right, so that's a little bit of a recap of what we covered last week. There was a lab that was due, and I think the due date for that has already passed. And then there was also an assignment for functions, which was the same assignment we did earlier in the semester, except instead of having a menu printed and everything in one main function, what's going to happen is you guys are going to modularize it, and you guys are going to put functions in for the print function. You're going to make a function for the add a number to the list, for the find the smallest number, find the largest number, and all of those things will be their own functions, and then you'll be able to call them from the main function. And then it'll just be better code, right? Because there'll be less repeated code, and you'll just be able to call functions in that case. All right, so that's kind of a recap of what we talked about last week. We'll get into week 10 right now. So I'll just end this recording as just a little bit of a recap to kind of remind you what we covered if it's been a while.